The Citrus Growers Association of Southern Africa calls for President Cyril Ramaphosa's intervention after the European Union imposed what it calls the citrus black spot regulations. The association says if the EU stops South Africa's imports because of its harsh restrictions, thousands of jobs will be lost. But to understand what the European Union demands are and what worries the citrus growers most, we're now joined by Mmatlou Kalaba, a senior analyst at the Bureau for Food and Agricultural Policy. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, Mr. Kalaba. Let's begin possibly by first explaining what citrus black spot is. Is this a disease or just a mere cosmetic effect on citrus fruits?
Good evening. Yes, well, it is described as a disease. Basically, it's a fungal pigmentation which causes, if you know a citrus fruit, an orange or tangerine, it generally has that orangish color, but then the spots basically are blackish in color. So you would have a spotted fruit, and it merely happens on the outer part of the peel. It doesn't even appear on the part that is edible. So it is caused by fungus usually found in much warmer climate environments. So basically that's what it is, and it has got no records of obviously causing let's say human sickness or so. However, it would still appear undesirable if it is spotted and look that way.
And I think that was my next question. Are there any health implications to this spot on the fruit, and what makes it so prevalent in terms of now creating regulations and laws around it for the EU?
So the way it has, moved from what I just described into an international trade issue is primarily through what is referred to as the sanitary and phytosanitary measures. In other words, the regulations that countries can introduce, importing countries generally, to avoid at least one of the two risks. The first risk is the one that we've just mentioned, that the risk to human harm or food safety risk. The second one relates to the disease developing in the orchards or producing areas, in other words, now destroying the crops of the importing country. So, and on both ends, in order to prove the existence or those kind of risks to be present, as you mentioned, the prevalence of it, it needs or it has to be supported by scientific evidence showing that indeed the presence of those spores or that the fungal infection can create or can develop in other growing areas or can cause harm to humans. And so far there hasn't been any cases that are known that have been caused by the citrus black spots.
So, Mmatlou, we know that South Africa is one of the largest exporters of citrus globally. What in these regulations is the main contention of South Africa with the EU?
So, the current situation in particular, it is caused by a case that is being contested by South Africa, as the tests which the EU said to have undertaken, they seem to appear as false positive, and we know this, or this is contested on the basis that the fruit which entered the EU borders in Portugal originated from the Western Cape. Now, in the cases of where citrus black spot is found in South Africa, none of the orchards in the Western Cape, and as I said, the cause of it is a fungus which occurs in warmer climates. Western Cape is relatively cooler compared to some of the regions in up northern parts of our country. So it's unlikely that could have been the citrus black spot. Hence, from that point of view, it can be a case of a false positive. However, historically, the EU tends to bring these issues up in terms of interceptions, in terms of finding at least a container or two that is sampled to have the citrus black spot. But it's actually minute cases relative to thousands and millions of cartons and tons that get exported globally.
I mean, the EU has always had these laws around the black spot. Why are we seeing more stringent laws sprouting out now? Because, I mean, the Citrus Growers Association has now alluded to protectionism. Could this possibly be the case with regards to the EU? As you say, there isn't any scientific evidence of this fruit bearing any harm to humans who would consume the fruit with a spot. All right, it seems as though we've lost Mmatlou Kalaba there on the line. We are discussing the EU's stringent laws on South African citrus growers who export citrus to the European Union, and this being the black spot laws, which actually has exporters of this fruit having to keep the fruit in cold storages for over 25 days under degrees of 2 degrees Celsius. And of course, we know that in South Africa, we do know. Oh, it seems as though we do still have Mr. Kalaba. Are you still on the line with us, Mr. Kalaba? We seemingly have a problem with our line.
But I am.
All right, Mr. Kalaba. I mean, you were still speaking to...
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can certainly hear you, Mr. Kalaba. You were still speaking to why we are now seeing these laws being stringent on citrus farmers in South Africa. I mean, we've always had these laws from the EU. Why now?
It's actually not why now, but it's more that lately it has been very intense that the EU is persistent with these regulations. And if you go back 10, 15 years, so the EU has been pushing or introducing or threatening to block South African exports, in particular of citrus. And furthermore, about 8 years ago, 7-8 years ago in 2016, when the EU and some of the Southern African countries signed the Economic Partnership Agreement, which basically becomes one of the largest that the countries have signed with the EU and the most liberal, which, ironically, the agreement was meant to address and avoid matters of this nature. The EU Parliament actually barely passed this the agreement. In other words, the parliamentarians who agreed that the trade negotiation, the trade agreement with South Africa should go ahead, just merely passed. And part of it was because the lobby groups associated with the citrus producers, mainly in Spain, were campaigning very hard for that. So I'm mentioning this history because of the point that these things have been coming over and over a period of time. However, we have seen in the last 18 months to 2 years, this being intensifying. The difficult part to understand is the fact that no other region or no other country in the world has this kind of measures on citrus. And secondly, the way we see it as more an anti-competitive approach towards South Africa relates to the point that you made earlier on, that South Africa is the second largest exporter of citrus to the world, and obviously the main supplier to the EU. And what tends to happen is that, particularly around this period after July going into the months of September and October, you tend to have an overlap in production between South Africa and the northern parts of the world. And this is when the competition gets intense. However, starting from November onwards, we export very little to no citrus. and you see that this kind of debates and discussions, they die off with absence of exports to the EU. But to be perfectly clear, these matters have been going on for several decades now. They get worse each year, but as I said, the last 18 months, they have been even more intense.
Now, one of the recommendations by the EU is that the citrus farmers need to keep their fruit in cold storages in under 2 degrees Celsius or more or less, as well as this being for 25 days. I just want to understand the impact of this on citrus farmers in South Africa, given the challenges that we have, especially with load shedding.
Yes, that regulation, indeed, the EU introduced it last year, June, and the implication that it has, or first, the objective is to try and to address the false codling moth, which is, again, another pest that tends to appear on the outer parts of the fruit. However, the impact of that, as we discussed earlier on any other issues in terms of risk have not been found. By basically pre-cooling a fruit for more than 20 days at -2 degrees affects the texture, affects the appearance, affects even the taste. Not only that, but it lengthens the period, because in addition to that regulation, it requires that the fruit be pre-cooled in those conditions in the exporting country, which means that after those 25 days, you still have another 2 weeks for the product to travel to the market, implying that the value, the quality, and all other attributes that consumers of the fruit look for, they would have changed substantially by putting it in those conditions. That would mean that the competition, or the fruit that has not been subjected, which would be the fruit from the EU generally, would then be more appealing to consumers than the one that has been subjected to those conditions. And effectively, very few exporters would go through that, because it's not only the quality, but it is expensive to put a product through all those processes.
Most certainly. So with that said, do you believe that South Africa should lodge a dispute with the World Trade Organization?
Actually, the dispute has been lodged as early as July last year. However, the WTO, someone said that, it moves like an elephant. It's relatively slow, even slow to its own processes. Because the first phase of lodging a complaint, the WTO would recommend a process called consultations, in which the two disputing parties are given an opportunity to settle the matter before it becomes too expensive, involves the legal institutions and other parties. So that process, which has happened so far but yielded no results, generally has a guideline of 2 months. As I said, from July last year, it should have gotten into the next phase. But we are where we are now, implying that that process, or that first phase, has not worked. So the next step now, which is what the industry and Citrus Growers Association of South Africa are pushing the South African government to do, is that they should move into a phase where the WTO sets up a dispute settlement body, which would now get into the process of adjudicating over this matter. And then now that becomes a more legal, more scientific, and it can be prolonged. But according to the WTO, that next phase should not take more than 2 months.
Sure, Mr. Kalaba, thank you so much for your time and for your insights this evening.